Hi, Abhijeet. Welcome
Hello,
to Ithihasa, the India History Podcast.
pleasure
And
to be here.
thank you for your time and for joining on the show. So, to the listeners of the podcast, I'll just give them gist about this new format, the video podcast that I've started here with you. So, to the listeners, so this is you've heard me so far on the Vijayanagara season one. It was mostly audio podcasts, and it followed kind of a story arc across the entire history of Vijayanagara. And this is a new format where I'm collaborating with um, people like Abhijeet, um, so to who are also equally invested and very much connected with the Vijayanagara history and also the Indian history. So I met Abhijeet through, I kind of discovered Abhijeet through Goodreads book reviews. And I reached out to him and we both connected in Vijayanagara. And our initial conversations were pretty amazing. So, and this is how we kind of this whole series of episodes that we are planning in collaboration with Abhijeet came to fruition, and that's the whole gist of this new format. And now I'll hand off to kind of to Abhijeet to give us a brief introduction of himself. Abhijeet, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Narendra. So, first off, I would like to say that it's a great pleasure to be here. I have listened to some of your podcast episodes, and I found it very interesting, especially when I was doing my own research with respect to Vijayanagara and Krishna Devaraya. So, I would like to say thank you so much for, I guess, contributing to the history in a way that a lot of people can use it and uh, use it for their own researchers for the purpose. With respect to me, as like I would like to say that I'm a techie by profession and a writer by passion. I am mainly writing about these days mainly about Indian historical fiction, that to Vijayanagara Empire. Before that, I did write a few more other books. One was a fantasy genre, and one was in alternate history. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's who I am.
That's awesome. So one thing I wanted to, I think when we both connected, the first question I had was, how did you get into writing, right? You're a techie. Of course, even I'm a techie, someone else could have asked me too. But similarly, right, I want to kind of understand how is it that you kind of ventured into something as difficult as getting into writing historical fiction novels, right? Writing a novel itself is extremely hard. But then you pick, and history is a genre which is very dry and very hard too, right? And then now you picked up historical fiction, right? How how did you take that plunge? I would imagine it would be a really, it would have been a really pain, really, a pretty tough kind of decision to make.
Yeah, sure. I think I can, for that, I think I'll have to go quite a lot back in my life. So, as a kid, I used to read a lot of books and everything. So, my oldest memories is like my mom, my aunt reading this Chanda Mama. I'm not sure whether a lot of listeners would know about that. So, this was this monthly magazine that used
Yes,
to come out, which is called as
I used
Chanda
to read
Mama.
it too. Yeah.
Yeah, which had this amazing stories about fantasy, about Indian fantasy and everything. So that is where I got hooked into the fantasy and everything. So as I grew, I read a lot of books from a lot of writers like Stephen Erickson, Brandon Sanderson, even J.R.R. Tolkien and everything. So as I was reading through these books, I realized one important thing is there isn't a lot of Indian based fantasy. I mean, there is whenever we think about Indian stories, it generally tends to be Ramayana and Mahabharata. and we don't seem to have gone beyond that. So even when there is fiction that is written or fantasy fiction that is written, it's always some version of Ramayana and Mahabharata. So for me, I wanted to read some new story. And since I couldn't find anything, I thought that I should write. So that's how my writing journey started, with writing a fantasy book. So it was known as
That's
Age of
awesome.
Apostasy. First sign, Age of Apostasy, sorry, actually. Knife Edge. That's the name of the book. So that was in 2014. That was my first novel, fantasy novel that I released. That was supposed to be part of a series, and then let's say I didn't get the response. So which meant that I did a slight pivot, and as I said, I am a voracious reader, which means that I keep reading different genres. And I think at that time, one of my genres that caught my attention was alternate history.
Right.
So which meant that for me, I thought that, hey, I was like, I think when I was reading that alternate history books, a lot of books, it was the same time I was doing some research on Maratha Empire, especially the Panipat. This is because for me, at that time, I was doing some amount of research on Indian history, and especially about Maratha history. And then I wondered, like, so in the Battle of Panipat, what happens is there is this stray shot. So the battle is, Sadashirao Bhau and Vishwas Rao are commanding the army. Vishwas Rao is in the front. He's commanding his army, and a stray cannonball which hits him and he dies.
Right.
Apparently, that cannonball was what changed history, because as soon
Right.
as he
Yes.
dies, Vishwas Rao, on hearing that Vishwas Rao is dead, Sadashirao Bhau gets down from his elephant, mounts a horse, and attacks in a suicidal charge, and he dies, and that's pretty much his history. So I wondered what happens if Vishwas Rao didn't die. So that was the basis of
Spark.
that
That was a
spark for that
spark.
alternate
Got it. Understood. Yeah.
alternate history. So that is something I released as a Kindle Unlimited book. So that is still available for people, readers, if they want to read it. So once that is done, because obviously it was an alternate history, I thought, well, let me just go one step further and go into historical fiction. Now here there were a lot of options for me, I guess. But then even as a kid, because I'm from a region called Karnataka, which is where we have a lot of history about Vijayanagara Empire and everything. I think it's something which we have seen in some movies and a few
Lot of
serials.
history. It's
Yeah,
in this. It's a
there's a lot
very
of history.
beautiful junction, right? Of both.
Yeah.
From coming from Deccan, Telugu,
Yep.
right, and Tamil, the Cholas, and you have the Hoysalas, and
Yes.
now the Vijayanagar. So
Yes.
yeah,
So,
it's
which meant
beautiful.
that for me, it was like a lot of options. I could just pick and choose. So I did decide on a few characters before finally settling on Krishna Devaraya, because one for me was, whenever we spoke about Krishna Devaraya, whenever somebody described Krishna Devaraya or something, it was always in conjunction with Tenali Ramakrishna. And Tenali Ramakrishna was a very small part of Krishna Devaraya's life, as in, so whenever we talk about Krishna Devaraya, it's always in conjunction with Tenali Ramakrishna. It is this, they are like this duet with Tenali Ramakrishna solving problems and everything. But of Krishna Devaraya himself, the king, the emperor, we don't hear much. Even Vijayanagara Empire, which ruled for fully for 200, actually it ruled for more than 200, but
Yes,
say 200 years in which they were maintaining their strength.
right.
There is very little information and very little books. So I felt like I had to probably write, because I couldn't find anybody else writing. So I think that is when the spark for historical fiction came in, and I wrote that book. So I wrote two books on Krishna Devaraya, and once that was done, the logical extension was Ramaraya,
Right.
because I mean it's pretty much known. Like anybody who writes on Krishna Devaraya, you will realize that like roughly 30 years after the death of the great king, uh, Vijayanagara Empire collapses.
It's fascinating, right?
Yeah,
The fact that I think we also spoke about this earlier when we connected, which is
yeah,
there is really for a legend of a character like Krishna Devaraya, who is even so beloved, even to this day, respected and admired, and you would see even now people are like resonating with that name. It's amazing that you were able to write a novel on him, especially when there were not much sources about his initial life, his adolescent life, and how he came to the throne. What was he doing in between then? From the moment he became an adolescent to a king, right? There's not much other than few dramatic and sensational stories about his getting on the throne.
Yep.
And then Alia Ramaraya is also such a fascinating character that
Right.
even in the podcast, when I started off, the Ithihasa India History Podcast, the season 1 on Vijayanagara, the first episode or the second episode that I started was the Battle of the Lakota. And the central character, of course, there are many characters in it, but the central character there is Alia Ramaraya, right?
Yep.
Whose death on the field actually unravels the entire, Vijayanagara army, leading to a rout, right? Um, so, so tell me this. Now that kind of we have acknowledged the paucity of sources on Krishnadevaraya's life, and even to that matter of fact, even Alia Ramaraya's initial life, right? To the point where he ended up marrying Krishnadevaraya's daughter. How were you able to um, come up with a kind of a coherent story, especially their initial lives, right? What sort of challenges you had to jump through, or hoops you had to jump through in terms of sources, right? I
Yep.
asked that because as a podcaster, as someone who has been running this historical narrative in the form of Vijayanagara season 1, I realize how difficult it is. So that's why I kind of love to hear more on that.
That's true. Actually, for me, I still feel that the earliest part of Krishnadevaraya's life in my books, they're probably furthest away from historical fact compared to the later parts of his life, because we have got more evidences and more understanding of what happened. As you mentioned, the earliest part is a bit tricky because we just don't know what happened. We don't have any information. So, in my case, I did go through the books, the historical books, which mentions about not just Krishnadevaraya, but rather the time of during that time, which is the 1485 to 1509. That's the period where, which I would call as the most interesting phase of history during the Vijayanagara, which is like the Sangama dynasty gets replaced by the Saluva dynasty
Yes.
under Saluva Narasimha. Then Saluva Narasimha goes into war, fights a war against the Orissa Gajapatis. He gets defeated, gets captured. The empire shake. The empire has got some huge issues with that. Then he comes back. Then he dies. Then his son becomes the king. So there is this series of things, right? So
Right.
for me, I think that series of events that happened, for me, I felt that Krishnadev, like at least my protagonist Krishnadevaraya, is not a silent observer in these events. Rather, he's an active participant, as although a minor participant, but he's still an active participant simply because his father, Turuva Narasimha Nayaka or Narasanayaka, was a significant. He was actually a major player during this time period. Like he was a senior general,
Right.
so which meant that his sons uh, were probably accompanying him, because it was pretty common. You would see that happening even with the Aliya Ramaraya, because a lot of his sons fought during the Battle of Talikota, although we don't hear the information. Similarly, uh, the sons of Tirumala Nayak also fights during the battle, and then Tirumala Raya, one of them even dies. So, which means that I felt that Krishnadevaraya and his elder brother, at least Veera Narasimha, he would be at least probably be part of these some of these events, not all of these events. So that is how I kind of like involved them in the sequence of events. Now, is it historically accurate? I'm probably not certain. I'm not sure whether they were there, because we don't have any information, but we don't have information they were not there. But having said that, uh, it's a fiction, so that portion is, I feel, is a greater amount of fiction than the story. So once that happens, because for me to maintain the coherence, the history itself allowed me to maintain the coherence. So I knew what happened, the historical events. So I know that what happens, like Salva comes to power, he fights a battle, he loses the battle, he's captured, the empire goes through a difficult time. He then comes back, but he dies. Then his son comes to power, who gets assassinated in a very short time. Then the second son comes to power, uh, who is under the guardianship of Toduvanarasanayaka, who gets killed or murdered, or however you
Right.
want to call it, later on. And then Veera Narasimha comes to power. He replaces the king. Then Krishnadevara comes to power. So we have this sequence of events. So that sequence of events was the glue for me for my story, because those events happened. So the characters, we know who are the central characters, which means that Krishnadevara could play a probably a minor role, or a like a viewer role in that character, in that sequence of events. So that's
Right.
pretty much how the story unfolds for in my book.
Yeah, yeah. Amazing, amazing. So because the usual portrayal, right? If you look at the movies, even the Telugu 1956 classic on Tenali Ramakrishna, right? Or any movies, even Kannada movies on Krishna Devaraya, right?
Yep.
The usual narrative is that Veera Narasimha, his stepbrother, Krishna Devaraya's brother, stepbrother, wanted to. They both never had a good relation, and he wanted him to be kind of assassinated or blinded, right?
Yeah.
So that his son could become. While on the movie, and on the screen, and when people are talking about it, that's the usual narrative, right? It sounds very sensational that you have Salva Timmarasu coming and playing the wise old grand chancellor, who, or the prime minister, who basically spots the talent in Krishna Devaraya and fools
Rules.
Veera
Also,
Narasimha Raya by showing him the eyes of two she goat, I guess, right? And saying that these are the eyes of Krishna Devaraya. We have like murdered him. He is either murdered or blinded, and so that's sensational, right?
yeah.
But in your novel, what I really liked, or probably even the narrative that I would subscribe to, or what I've come to kind of understand based upon trying to connect the dots after referring multiple sources, is um, is that probably, right, for all practical reasons, Krishnadevaraya and his stepbrother probably had decent relations, if not deep, loving relation, right? They had some sort of a mutually, they had mutual respect for each other, right? They were both in their own ways kind of visionaries, right?
Yep.
Which meant that they would not be playing us- these games, short-sighted games, which would endanger the empire, right?
Yep.
I like how you start off your novel by showing how he accompanies his brother on the campaigns, and right, you show kind of a more realistic a relation, which I think I can see that, right? I think even my own research have found that probably is the most plausible explanation,
Yep. I think,
right?
yeah, I think the one reason I took a slightly different approach was because Krishnadevaraya did not come to power in a vacuum. So when we say that Timarasu outmaneuvers everybody, the problem here is without having a strong support base, right?
Right.
Krishnadevaraya couldn't have come to power, which means that
Yes.
he should have been supported by the Nayakas who
The
supported
nobility.
his,
Yes.
yeah, his elder brother.
Right.
So it's a bit stretch to imagine that the Nayakas would, like, mainly by this time most of the Nayakas had become pretty powerful,
Right.
which means that they were looking for chances to revolt, and many of them do revolt as soon as Krishna comes to power.
Yes.
So a situation where Veera Narasimha doesn't want his brother to succeed, and then somehow they play a game and then do it, and if that information gets out, which pretty much means that there is going to be a lot of Nayakas in
Yes.
revolt, and some of them are very powerful. Like, for example, Nagama Nayaka was a very powerful ruler. Well, not ruler, but he was a general in the army, as was Aravidu Pukka,
Right.
the progenitor of Aliya Ramaraya. So which means that these guys had strong power bases. We don't hear them revolting
Right.
until later. Nagamarayaka's revolt comes later, but we don't hear them actually causing any trouble to Krishnadevaraya, and which for me felt a bit odd that these powerful generals who served Salwa Narasimha and Krishnadevaraya's father agreeing to a candidate who wasn't really accepted by the king, Veera
Right.
Narasimha. That itself made it a little bit suspect for me.
Right.
And the thing is, what happens afterwards? So Krishnadevara comes to power, and immediately he goes and fights a war. So which means that he had the command of the army. So whether we want to accept it or not, Krishnadevara was very talented as a general. Like he led a lot of battles
Yes.
from the front. So and you don't develop that like
Yes.
without
No.
some experience. Like it takes
Yes.
some
It's
time to
either
develop.
either it's an innate gift or it has to be right really honed in, right, or
Yes,
trained.
yes.
Yes.
Even with the innate gift, like for
Yeah.
example, say Alexander
Right.
or anybody, any other general that we see, right? We see that it takes some time for the
Time. Yes.
soldiers to trust them. So, which meant that Krishnadevaraya probably, if not hadn't commanded large armies, he was still somebody who was comfortable with soldiers.
Absolutely.
The army knew him, so which was probably one of the reason why you can see what happens later, which is he fights this huge battle, defeats the invading kings, chases after the king of Bijapur, kills him on the field of battle during the
Right.
follow-up battle. All this happens within 2-3 years of his rule.
Yes.
So that, and also none of the big Nayakas revolt. So
Right.
that shows that Krishnadeva was pretty secure, which meant that he had
Yes.
a lot
He
of
had a lot
backing
of
from.
yes. Absolutely. Yes. That's why I'm saying that even in my own understanding, right? I would I subscribe to that same uh, idea. It
Yep.
it makes more sense, but I would understand why the the story of the goat and the eyes and all of that, right, would appeal to people, over
Yeah, I
ages.
think Veera Narasimha is kind of a little bit tragic character in the sense like he was a pretty capable guy. It's
Yes.
just he dies very young.
Yes.
Because I think a lot of the innovation, I mean, some of the innovation at least, because the innovation of the military of Vijayanagara was happening from the time of Salva Narasimha. And I think Veera Narasimha expands that innovation, and Krishnadevara takes it to the logical conclusion, which is a
Right.
movement away from a infantry centric and a elephant centric forces to a slightly higher percentage of cavalry in their armies. So
Right,
you can
right,
see that
absolutely.
happen.
Yeah, the Veera Narasimha Raya and even, Saluva Narasimha, they both actually played really pivotal roles in stopping the implosion of
Of them.
Vijayanagara Empire, right? Because at that time, all of its borders were shrinking, its territories were getting raided left, right, and center, right? So yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, let's stop at that so that we don't give out
All
all
the
the juicy
juicy.
bits in this
Yep.
in the same episode. But now, tell me about how did you balance the creative storytelling with historical facts? How, because you have to walk a very delicate line there. Even I myself have to walk a thin line where I don't inject my own biases or go too too overboard with
Yep.
in the way I'm like interpreting things or trying to depict what might have happened. But I'm pretty sure where there are places where you have to fill in the blanks.
The banks here. Yeah, that's true. So I think for me, I was a bit okay. I think for me, the biggest thing was history was like for me, the historical accuracy was very important, which meant that the sequence of events was pretty much maintained. But that said, the narration and the storytelling and all, it kind of revolved around the historical events. I mean, as I mentioned, the 15 years or 20 years from 1485 to 1509 was extremely volatile. There were
Right.
so many things happening, and I really did not need to make any kind of extra. things to make it more interesting. There were so many things happening in Vijayanagara at that time. There were invasions, there was political assassinations, there was rebellions, there was anything and everything that could happen in the kingdom was happening at that time. So for me, it wasn't a problem at all because I could just retell history as is, and it was still would be very interesting because that period, that initial period, was very interesting. And once Krishna came to power, we have, like, again, I try to maintain a lot of historical accuracy, especially with respect to the major events of his life.
Right.
But that said, yeah, obviously there is some amount of fiction
So what
involved.
in short, what you're saying is that there is already so much of drama there that it made your job easier.
Yes, yes,
Right.
yes. If anybody who just looks at the empire at that time and then tries to see what happens, it took a lot of really capable men to hold the empire in its place. So
Right.
even though Krishnadevaya was the pinnacle of that series of capable guys, you need to understand all of them were very capable. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to hold the empire. So Salva Narasimha, Veera Narasimha, Tuluva Narasanayaka, and then Krishnadevaya. All four of the men were responsible. So,
Right.
and it was always very interesting period. So, which meant that for me, at least for the initial book, till the time when Krishnadeva comes to power, the first book, it all was already very interesting. And once Krishnadeva comes to power, you find that he's a very dynamic and a person who just couldn't, he had so many ideas. I mean, it's a bit tragic that he dies in 1529
So
because
this is something that I really like about the genre of historical fiction, or even the Dan Carlin style historical
podcast.
podcasts, or to be honest, I've been inspired by Dan Carlin. As I
Yeah,
used to be an avid listener of his show, and Laszlo Montgomery and all. The one thing I kind of really like when you contrast it with the academic historical books that people might have written, right? So these reputed academists in this field would have written, right? They tend to be very uh, loaded with historical facts, but less of drama and story, right? It mostly used to be very much, if you see most of these books, historical books all tend to be very much chronological in order, right? It is devoid of um, the human element, right? It's always, okay, this is the dynasty, this went from here, this were the administrative instruments they use, this is how their military was structured, right? And this king, from he ruled X number of years, he had these policies and all. But what is missing is the perspective that um, these figures, historical figures in these books too, these historical books too, were humans like us. They
Yeah,
made all the mistakes that we are making today. They had all, if not all, they had a lot of flaws, which, you know, of the flaws which are a result of a human psyche, right? The leaders themselves back then were not so different from today, right? They too made some short-term mistakes, long-term benefits, things like that, right? I think that's one thing that I really like about your genre of books or these kind of podcasts is there's a conscious effort to retell history um, from a human perspective, less of facts but more of a kind of a story, because I've realized that something as dry as history, if you just throw a book at people, nobody has time to first of all read a book like that, right? An academic book, right? That might have been published by Stanford or Harvard researchers, right? It might be extremely accurate, but then I used to read a lot of it on either Mughal or Greek or Roman or even Vijayanagara, right? And it used to be so painful. You had to literally have the determination and perseverance to sit through and finish it. People, you and me probably have that sort of patience because we are genuinely kind of passionate about these things, right? We are not, it's because it's not our actual bread and butter, it's our hobby. So probably we go to that space, that hobby, as to let out our steam, right?
Yeah,
From our usual stressful daily lives or our jobs,
yeah,
right?
that's true.
Yeah. So I was, even at Goodreads, when I read your this thing, I was like, okay, I need to talk to this guy.
I'm glad we spoke because
Yeah.
I did, as I mentioned, I have listened to some of your early podcast episodes. So yeah, but then so which meant that in fact I was planning to listen to your later podcast episode with respect to
No
Venkatapati
worries.
Raj.
Yeah, I mean, if the foundation series, right, which is of the Ithihasa season one, Vijayanagara, it's about the events leading up to the foundation of Vijayanagara. Most of the books, if you see, or the narratives, they always start from, we spoke about this too. They start from just Harihara and Bukka suddenly,
Yeah,
starting an empire, right? But how did Vijayanagara come to be, right? I know we are going to touch upon in depth in the following episodes, but um, I just wanted to kind of talk a little on this from the perspective about how to humanize these kind of stories, right?
yeah,
The Foundation series, one of the mini series within this season, was one of the hardest, in my opinion.
yeah,
And I also love that mini series because I poured myself into it. My major challenge was how to take all these disparate facts that are spread across probably 30, 40 sources, how to kind of, there's so many gaping holes in it, all sorts of narratives, the multiple stories about how Harihara and Bukkaraya came to be, right? And it was for me such a challenging task to tell that story in a way where it will strike a chord with the
yeah,
listeners and the
yeah,
people, and at the same time uh, be as much as possible historically accurate,
yeah,
right, without compromising on that. How do you tell that kind of a thing? And all the precursor events that have happened, right, prior to that, the probably almost 100 or 200 years that led to it, led
yeah,
to the foundation of Vijayanagara, is in its own such a fascinating and a thrilling story.
yeah,
The characters in it, the Islamic sultanates from Delhi sultanates, right, coming down into Deccan, and it's amazing, right?
yeah,
I think I really learned the human aspect of storytelling from history, taking a dry thing like it and making it not only palatable but something that will really strike a chord, right?
yeah,
I think that's really, and in that sense, right, even your novel, the way it starts off, I think it starts off in a some sort of a if not pitch battle, but it's just some sort of a skirmish where it is starting, where Krishna Devaraya is really raring, and he wants to go into the thick of the action
yeah,
and is being pulled back, right?
yeah,
It kind of showed me the human element, right? Instead of just saying, hey, this Krishna Devaraya, fought a skirmish there, 3,000 lost on this side, 4,000 lost on this side. Instead of
yeah,
saying that, right? Showing the human element of Krishna Devaraya and Narsimharaya, who is like trying to pull back his younger brother. I know you're really, want to go and, show your prowess on the field, but this is not the time. He's pulling back his younger brother. And I think that is what good storytelling to me looks like, right?
yeah. So I think like that was one of the reasons why I wanted to start Krishnadevara's story when he was a little bit younger, because a lot of the stories for me, the problem is, or the movies that I've watched and everything, they show a perfect king. So
Right.
you So a character which starts out as perfect, it's not as interesting. So in my story, Krishnadeva starts very young. He makes mistakes and he learns from those mistakes. He
Right.
tries. He There are consequences for his mistakes. He understands what he has done wrong, why he is doing things. So to put it simply, he's a kid at the beginning of the story. So which means that he makes the same mistakes that a lot of us would have done. Was it historically 100% accurate? Maybe, but then we can't say that Krishnadeva starts out as this perfect guy. No, he would probably start out exactly like us, making those mistakes and then learning from them and then coming up to wherever he is. So that's Krishnadeva's story.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that is amazing. So now, tell me more about the reception of your. I think there were three books, right? Three books.
Yeah.
One on Alia and two on Krishna Dev Raya. How was the reception for each of them from readers
Was
and people who have like
so
read?
so from the readers at least I've got pretty good reviews. So most of the reviews have been very nice. A lot of them like the book. Yeah.
Did they like the Krishna Dev Raya one more or the Alia Ram?
Krishnadeva one
Oh
more.
wow.
Ali
Okay.
Ramarayas was a bit short, I guess.
Okay.
A lot of them like Krishnadeva more simply because I think a lot of them were more interested in Krishnadeva than Ramaraya. So I think there is a slight amount of bias there. But
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm pretty sure there is. So
So which
that's the thing. Unless you really study life of Alia Ramaraya, right? You won't like we. You don't tend to, for an average reader, right? They
so yeah.
wouldn't realize how much of a fascinating character he is.
I think Aliya Ramaraya's life probably would have been more interesting if he hadn't died on the battlefield. Had he
Right.
won the battle,
Yes.
it would have been interesting to see. Like had he died of a natural cause, I still felt that Vijayanagara would have struggled even
Yes.
if he had died without even before the battle. I mean, if he hadn't died on the battlefield and if he had continued to rule on his own, but it would have been different. The reception of people would have been different to his rule because he was pretty successful. People don't realize that until that last battle, uh, Aliya Ramaraya had been very successful. The armies of Vijayanagara, the empire, everything was in a very good state or a great state, if you want to ask, if you want to call that. So it was that, but then you could see his mistakes slowly
Yes.
catching up. But yeah,
Yes. Yeah, I think he overplays his hand.
yeah,
He goes heavily into the gunboat diplomacy,
yeah,
right? Instead of trying to use the Kautilyan style of subtle to defeat his enemies, which he actually does to initially to a larger extent. But then somehow I see I see that he transitions into much more heavy-handed approach with the gunboat style diplomacy, which ends up kind of backfiring and uniting the feuding Deccan sultanates into
yeah,
a single deadly alliance, right? Which ultimately is what brings down the or routes the Vijayanagara army on Tallikota, right? I
yeah,
think even at that point too, right? If again, this is my own kind of educated guess or speculation. Uh, Even if at that point Arya Ramaraya had listened to the counsel of his ministers and pulled back, he himself, if he hadn't been on the battlefield, uh, or if he or Vijayanagara army had waged a much more different kind of battle, right? Instead of one big decisive battle, set piece battles where you're like defeating kind of, because you have to understand the Deccan Sultanates, the alliance too was coming in, if not too far, it was coming way far. Their own supply lines, while they were sure secure, but still they were not 100% secure, right? They are coming into a territory where Vijayanagara is more strong. And I think if Vijayanagara army, earlier Ramaraya had played a more subtle waiting game, I think I think the trajectory of the battle probably would have been a bit different, is what I think. But again, I might be
Agreed.
wrong.
So I feel the same. So if you see the battles that happened between the not just the sultanates and Vijayanagara, but even with the Bahmani Empire before that, there aren't a lot of set piece battles. Most of it were sieges.
Right.
That is because what happened was over a period of time, both the empires built up these fortresses throughout the
Yes. A
border.
series of chain of fortresses.
Fortresses.
Yes.
So there was
Yes.
Mudgal, Adoni,
Adoni.
Raichur,
Yes. Yes.
Diwali, like half a dozen fortresses. So which meant
Yes.
that all Ramaraya had to do was just allow them to come and capture a few fortresses
Yes.
and spend their full abilities. Because what you need to understand is these fortresses were something that an enemy couldn't leave behind them. So if you
Yes.
march, leaving the fortress and march towards Hampi, that means that the army in the fortress would just come in and cut your supply line
Supply of.
as yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So which meant that they had to spend their time trying to conquer these fortresses. But
Right.
the more time they used to spend conquering the fortresses, it meant that the army couldn't
Yes.
sustain itself for a longer period because they were losing their now men, they were losing supplies. So which meant that the campaign would have been exactly like how most of these campaigns would have
It's a
been.
war of attrition. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yes. Because
And
the,
Vijayanagara would have won that war.
yes,
If not
absolutely.
won, but the impact would have been pretty trivial.
Right. Because, yes, because the internal tensions between the sultanates themselves would have come to the fore, right? If
Yeah, it would have
the siege,
ruptured the
if
alliance.
they ruptured their alliance, and they would have all been splintered, right? Just the time, given enough time, that would have happened. But yeah, because the interesting point that you make also about the chain of fortresses, and using the give up some fortresses, right, and then slowly uh, kind of cause that attrition. That's a very interesting point, because exactly probably 80 years after, or if not 80, 40 years after even collapse of Vijayanagara, you see that those exact same strategies and tactics being employed by Chhatrapati Shivaji, by the
Exactly.
Marathas,
Yeah.
where they're actually conquering all these Bijapuri fortresses, not in one or two, but in dozens, or a period of a month or two. And then when they're pushed back by even Mughals and all, if you read about the Treaty of Purandar and all of it, you'll see that there is lot of fortresses and forts that the Marathas give up as part of the treaty. But then during the 27-year war, the Mughals and Marathas and all of it, right, you see that over the period, gradually Marathas play the same war of attrition on them, on the Mughals, slowly start capturing and draining Mughals, because they were
Yeah.
far off from their own initial base. Their supply chains are extremely long, weak, right? So yeah, I think that's a very amazing point. So yeah, now before we really go and discuss everything in this episode, and give out all the juicy bits to everyone, so let's quickly switch gears and go to what are your future plans for any new books or projects. I would really love to. I think even our listeners would love to hear.
Yeah. So at this point, I'm thinking of taking a break from historical fiction. I mean, it's tentative. I might decide to pick up again, but the thing is, as you know, because you are a historical podcaster, you know the amount of time and research it takes to
Yes.
do justice to each of these characters.
Yes.
And while I do have a few characters in mind, uh, the information that is available about them is even sparser compared to Krishnadevara, which means that I would be going seriously from a historical fiction to a pure fiction uh, genre. So, which means that I probably would want to take a break with historical fiction and try to write something fantasy, which is what I'm trying to coming up with that a fantasy novel that is based on Indian mythology, but
Understood.
not really on Ramayana or Mahabharata.
Got it. Is it more like, I think, who is this writer long back? I read Amish Tripathi. I think he had a lot. What
Uh,
would you say is more similar to that? It's on Indian, on Hindu
It's
goddesses, and he weaves the stories around them.
well, that's how it started, but now it's no longer so simple.
Right.
So it is heavily influenced by Indian mythology and Indian
Understood.
cultures and everything, but it doesn't involve any gods or goddesses
Got
because
it.
once again, I didn't want to write something that is like it's a catch 22 situation. So writing something like that would get a recall value for the readers because a lot of the reason why a lot of writers write about Rama and Mahabharata is because there is a recall value. People know the story, so
Yes.
people are only looking for what is the variation.
Right.
And I think I'm taking a chance by writing something completely new. So this is going to be a completely new fantasy novel, which
Wonderful.
is set in a kind of an alternate world which is where there are a lot of cultures, not just us, but there's a lot of cultures inspired by our own historical uh, setting.
Understood. Understood. Amazing. Yeah, I think I really wish you all the best. I know it's a momentous task to write, to start a book, to write a single chapter, to write even a single line is so hard, right? To come up with a scene is so hard. I have felt that pain, and I'm pretty sure you have felt that pain like 10x, right? Finishing a book, right? So, okay, now what is the advice that you give to these young aspiring writers or people with regular jobs who have this, probably somewhere they want to write something, broach some topic that they love? How would you kind of, as a published author of 3 novels, I would say, or probably 5, like counting your 2 fantasy novels too, what are some tips that you would give?
I would say the first thing is just read a lot and write regularly.
Understood.
So the reading is important because one, it helps you expand your horizons, which means that don't just read the genres that you like. Try to read genres you don't like. So no, not don't like, but then which is not your cup of tea. Like for example, while I write fantasy novels, I still read detective fiction, crime, whodunits, those kind of things, just to keep my mind sharp. And you never know, you can get some ideas from that as well. That said, it's just the reading will allow you to improve your own vocabulary and also understand how the other author approaches storytelling. So that will help you to improve as
Amazing.
a writer.
So tell me.
And writing regularly is important.
Yes.
Like it doesn't have to go towards anything. You can just write, like pick up some random topic and then write half an hour or something. Because if you want to write a book which is like 200 pages, you will end up writing 600 pages first and then you cut it to 200 pages, which means that you need to have that dedication to keep writing every day because otherwise you wouldn't be able to finish the book, or you'll probably finish it, but it's going to be a multi-year effort. And losing focus and losing motivation is very common for a lot of writers.
Absolutely. No, I can totally understand that, and feel it. That's amazing. Cool. So how were you able to hone or come up with the techniques for storytelling? Right. I asked this because I myself have grappled with it for the mini series episodes, and especially Foundation and the Battle of Raichur mini series too. It's a craft, right? To dramatize something, to take some boring facts and to write a scene. Basically, you have to tell a story, right? How were you able to learn that craft enough uh, to help you to kind of, or to enable you to write these 3 books on Vijayanagara? I would love to hear more on that.
Yeah, I think one, as I mentioned, that reading and regular writing is something that is very important because while I've been like as you mentioned, I've published like what 5 books, but I probably have written like around 10, 12 books, which means that you there are books that I've written which
Never
uh,
finished.
no, some of them are finished, but I just
Finished.
don't want
Okay.
to release it. So
Right.
which means that it's a learning process. So even
Yes.
now, I would say there is a lot I need to learn, but over a period of time, you kind of get into it. For me, I think some of the major things that I try to make sure is, say, uh, for a protagonist, if you want to call it a protagonist or an antagonist, I try to humanize them. So that is the way I try to approach my story, wherein, say, if there is a character, he needs to have his motivations, and then he needs to have some kind of obstacles. So
Right.
it's trying to dumb it down too much, but pretty much
Basically,
if I,
hero's journey, right? For
yeah,
people who are,
yeah,
yeah, it's
hero's
just,
journey, or even
it's the
villain's journey, if you want to call it.
yes, yes, the
So the
story
journey
arc.
is important. So which means that
Yes,
once you have the journey in mind, you can actually then try to dramatize. So,
absolutely.
and because I tend to be a little bit more realistic, so my dramatization is not as over dramatic. So
Right,
none of my historical fiction has got some kind of magical lightning bolt striking, or metaphorically or literally.
right,
So so that is something. I mean, but if I'm writing a fantasy, then probably there will be lightning bolt striking.
right,
So
right.
it depends on the genre and everything. So,
Yes,
but that's pretty much it. So one is practice. You have to write it regularly. So you will, the more you write, the more you will be able to hone your craft, and there is no shortcut to that. So
right,
there are some people who are probably very good, but I still feel even with them, they would have spent a lot more time practicing, and we just don't see that.
right.
So a lot of the writers, when they come into picture, that's when we see that. Like for example, Brandon Sanderson is a good example. I think he mentioned in one of his podcasts that the book that is most associated with, the first one, the Mistborn trilogy, the first Mistborn book that came in, that's what established him as a writer. But he had probably written 20 books before that. So which means that it took him a long time to arrive as a writer. So
Yes,
writing is a journey. So some writers get very lucky and they get their thing in the first book or the second book, but a lot of the writers take some time. So
right.
which means that you build, you move on, just enjoy the journey. Don't try to expect instant results, because it's not a craft that will give you an instant results.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. No, no. I totally kind of can understand and see that because even for the Vijayanagara podcast too, like I said, since it's a podcast where you're not actually writing or the readers aren't reading, you have to do everything with your voice. I
Yeah.
think to me, honing on those techniques, the modulation, voice modulation, and how I'm structuring, how I'm writing, the way I have to write the script needs to be in a way where when I am narrating or talking, it should feel natural. I think to me, honing that was the hardest
Yeah.
um, because even in the foundation series and all, first of all, coming up with a all the character arcs. For example, if you take the episode of um, Blood of Hoysala, I guess that's the episode. It's about Veeraballala of Hoysala dynasty, who plays a very crucial role in the formation of foundation of Vijayanagara Empire, right, or the kingdom. Um, i- Initially, I only wanted to focus a little on the Veeraballala, but then as I kind of started piecing together all these various scenes, right, to make a big, uh, what do you say, kind of a saga, I kind of was able to learn and stretch out the character arcs or flesh out the character arcs of each of these characters. I think for me that was the really hardest part,
Yeah.
um, because you're taking these dry academic or historical facts and trying to piece together, and then how do you go about rendering all of that in a seamless narration. um, I think that was for me the hardest in this, because this medium is a bit different. But yeah,
and I'm guessing it would have taken you a lot of takes and retakes and
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely.
So pretty
It's
much
the
that's
same
the
thing,
thing.
right? I've
Yeah.
like how you said, you've written so many books that got shelved, or even after they were finished or half finished or three-fourth finished. There were many scripts that I wrote which I had to like literally scratch them out and throw them aside, right? And then take the good pieces of it and start writing in a way where it would actually appeal and touch people. I
Yeah.
think, and that was and also a lot of if you see a lot of most of my podcast episodes, you will have a lot of background music too, which kind of so I had to learn that aspect too, where the
Oh,
music is matching the actual underlying story. Right. It
okay.
needs to be somber, or if it needs to be a bit
Dramatic.
serious, right? Things like that. So there are some tricks of the trade where I was lucky that I was able to kind of experiment and learn. I think whether as a podcaster or as a author yourself, or as a novelist, right? I think um, I'm sure you would agree that experimenting, right? Not just picking the first idea you get, but try to swarm it all ideas there and try to see which one really appeals to you, which captures you. Probably it should capture you first. Then
Yeah. I think
yeah,
another thing is uh, that is for me as well. It was always like when I started writing, for me, it was always I had to get the best thing out.
right,
And that's a mistake a lot of the early writers or young writers do, which is as they write, they keep on editing it. They write, they edit, they write, they edit, which means that they lose focus. They keep on editing whatever they've written because there is never enough editing. Like every time you write something, you feel, oh, I could have written it better.
right,
So that's a trap that a lot of writers get into. So I think that is something you need to look out for, which is basically write your story. You'll anyway have to re-edit it. So just the first one is considered to be your first draft. I'm pretty
awesome.
sure that would be how the script also would go. You would write
And
your first script, then you go and re-edit it. You wouldn't spend your entire time trying to modify the first few lines, trying to figure out, oh, okay, this is how I will say, I'll greet my audience. Because if you do that, you're going to be stuck with that. It'll be an infinite loop.
right,
So
understood.
that is one thing I would say. I would advise that if it's a story, just write the story, however bad it is. Once you've written the story, you can always improve it
Right,
because
improve it. Absolutely, yeah. That's those are pretty great tips. So that was really amazing discussion about yourself, your work, and both of our shared interest of Vijayanagara. So I think we should end this episode here, so that the listeners have enough time to digest this before we release our next episode, or we do record our next episode. So just to give a sneak peek to the listeners, so like I said initially, me and Abhijeet is really kind enough to collaborate with me. We're going to do almost, probably 4 or 5 or even more. We don't know, but we're keeping it flexible. But pretty sure there'll be 4 or 5 episodes that we are going to go in depth into Vijayanagara. If you are someone who loves Indian history, you are a fan of Vijayanagara history, you ought to be listen or tune in for these episodes with Abhijeet, because they are going to go, the conversations are going to be very organic. We might start from point A, then suddenly go to point X and come back to D, right? So we're going to traverse the entire timeline of Vijayanagara, and probably even the kingdoms surrounding Vijayanagara in that period. We might, if you're lucky, we might end up touching other aspects, um, other periods of Indian history itself, as part of the conversation that comes out of the Vijayanagara discussion. So to give a sneak peek of the next episode, um, The episode 2 with Abhijeet is going to be on the high level summary of it would be the importance of Vijayanagara to Indians and Hindus. Right, we're going to kind of discuss on the significance of Vijayanagara and why do people still, resonate with it more than any other kingdoms, especially in the south. We're going to go brief history of Vijayanagara, the key figures, contributions. Today's discussions on key figures was just a trailer, right? And the geographic and political context of Vijayanagara and why Vijayanagara was so important in preserving and promoting Sanatana Dharma or Hindu culture. We're going to talk about it. We're going to if there's enough time, we're going to touch on the architectural ingenuity of Vijayanagara, the marvels that they have left in Hampi or in South India. And influence of Vijayanagara on the modern society and the modern Hindus right now, the impact of it on our modern psyche, which we can still feel. The fact that we are talking about this, the fact that Abhijeet has written these books and I have done this podcast is just a testament to that Vijayanagara's impact on our psyche is there. And we're going to kind of go in depth in it. So that is a sneak peek to the next episode, and I hope all the listeners have enjoyed this episode with someone so knowledgeable and interesting like Abhijeet. And I hope you enjoy the next few episodes too, and you tune in. And Abhijeet, thank you very much for taking time out. And
My pleasure.
I really enjoy talking to you.
Same here. I think we have a lot more to talk in the coming
Yes,
episodes.
absolutely. Yes. So see you in the next episode. I'm pretty sure it's going to be a great one for our listeners. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you very much.